Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Peter Bryant. I'm the Head of Learning, Technology and Innovation here at the LSE. Welcome to those in the room and also welcome to our people watching live on our YouTube stream. And this is our third Networked Edge or NetworkEDGE for this academic year. And we're very happy to have Professor Sonia Livingstone here from the Department of Media and Communications here at the LSE. And this actually follows on really well from our previous NetworkEDGE session with Leslie Haddon, who's in the audience today as well, for those of you who have seen that. And if you want to watch that video, you can on our YouTube channel. And for us, this is a really engaging area of debate within, not just within the educational technology world, but also within the wider people engaging in research around society and the relationship of society and technology. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Sonia to talk on developing social media literacy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today. I'm going to talk about a piece of qualitative research that comes out of the eKids Online project and indeed follows and complements some of what Leslie said before. Just a very brief snapshot of the project itself, which is a multi-country project which tries to understand how children and young people are engaging with the media, with the internet and new digital media. And the focus is really on 9 to 16-year-olds, so it covers quite an age range, and the idea is to provide evidence base for policymakers, though also to generate new academic research. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides of the quantitative findings within which we kind of identified the puzzles by which we set up our qualitative research. And the quantitative findings help in a way to set some of the concerns that young people experience on the internet in a kind of wider context. So we asked children in the eKids Online survey that was of 25 countries in 2010, and then again in the Net Children Go Mobile survey, which is led by Giovanna Mascheroni, who is also here, in 2014. Just a very simple survey question, is there something on the internet that bothered you in the last year? And I put this up really to show that most children say no in answer to that question. So the problems are, let's keep them in proportion. But that there are some interesting differences. There are some particular concerns around girls who are more likely to say that something has bothered them in the last year. And there is a kind of an age trend such that the problems rise as children get older. And then I've just put up some quotes of some of the kinds of things that children say bother them online, of which I want to focus today on those that are kind of particularly associated with social networking. A lot of them concern content. Actually, children have a whole host of risks that they're concerned about, which we have written about on other occasions. I want to home in on social networking sites and kind of pursue the question of whether we can think of their developing social media literacy as they come to engage with the kinds of ways of conducting their relationships that is now possible for them on the internet. So this was one more kind of qual into quantitative piece of work where we asked children in our survey. The survey was 25,000 children across Europe, and we asked them to just tell us some of the things that bothered them, or one thing that bothered them on the internet in the last year, and then we coded this according to the kind of problem that they identified and whether they linked it to any particular kind of platform. And I do want to have the kind of questions of the different spaces and the different platforms that children and young people engage with on the internet as a kind of running thread through my talk, because the ways in which they become media literate or socially media literate partly depends on the affordances and the designs of the different kinds of sites. So of all the 25,000 children, about 10,000 described some problem, and of those about 4,000 linked it to a particular platform. And the point I wanted to make here is that you can see kind of where the preponderance is. So video sharing sites, the primary concern that children have is with violent content. Websites, the primary concern they have is with pornographic content. social networking sites, the primary concern is what we call conduct-related problems, the ways in which peers conduct their relations. Also, a lot of colours are quite hard to tell on this. Violence on games, contact kinds of risks in chat rooms and so on. You can see that the kinds of problems that children are encountering on the internet is somehow related to the different platforms that they engage with, and that's why I think the notion of media literacy is particularly kind of useful, because it connects what they know about the world and what they know about different kinds of sites. And one more slide from our kind of scene setting, just to show that it's not just that social networking is associated in children's minds with kind of conduct problems, but it's associated with what I would want to call risky opportunities, which we've kind of framed as exactly positioned between the problems, as it were, and the possibilities. So, as we know, young people are engaging in social networking with alacrity. These figures follow the pattern of the ones that I showed you before, where purple shows you 2010 and turquoise shows you 2014. And you can again see that there is first enormous take-up of social networking sites. Facebook is the darker band. There's been a kind of Facebook takeover in the past few years in terms of children's social networking. Social networking is highly age-related, and this is partly about what children are allowed to do, because they're not meant to be on Facebook and so on under 13, but as you can very clearly see, age ratings are not respected, and they are beginning social networking from 9, and especially from around about 11 or 12. So there's something going on very strongly with age in relation to social networking, and I want to pull out the question of age and how we unpack that, how we interpret what differences age makes. And then we, in the project, began to think about what kinds of ways in which children might be engaging with their friends on social networking sites that could be considered problematic, could lead them towards some of the problems, but might also be understood from their point of view often as opportunities. So having a public profile on a social networking site is considered by many adults to be a risk, but considered by many young people as a way of getting new friends, making themselves more visible, and we can see that there are some kind of real cultural differences that in fact I'm probably not going to dwell on here, but one can see, for example, that in Romania having a public profile is much more common than in Ireland. Is that about the way in which the sites are set up and the sites that they use? Is that about parental practices? Is that about cultures? I think there are lots of kind of questions about the interface between young people's practices and the particular kinds of sites that they engage with. So by risky opportunities, we are particularly thinking about some of the things that young people say that sound alarm bells in the heads of their parents and teachers and seem exciting and full of opportunities for the young people. So do you talk about private things on the internet, rings alarm bells for parents, seems a kind of interesting opportunity if you're 13 years old. Do you talk about different things on the internet? Do you find it easier to be yourself on the internet than not? As you can see, a third to a half of 9 to 16-year-olds are saying, 11 to 16-year-olds in this case are saying yes to this question. So there is, again, this is not everybody. This is not the even the majority, but there is a kind of significant number and proportion who are exploring these risky opportunities somewhere, as it were, in between what it is that is obviously harmful and what it is that is obviously beneficial. And in the qualitative work, I want to kind of unpack what that kind of space of engagement looks like from the point of view of the young people. So it's become a mantra in policy circles to say what we want to do is to maximize opportunities and minimize risk. And what any qualitative research immediately makes you see is that that is risk and opportunities defined as adults see it, children see it a little bit differently. So adults see meeting strangers on the internet as a problem, children see that they will call that making new friends or widening their circle of contacts. Adults worry when young people put their personal information online. But young people know, actually everybody knows, that you cannot engage at all on the internet unless you put your personal information in some way online. There is a kind of mismatch in perspectives that is complicating that policy discourse. And one way in which many are thinking, and particularly in educational circles many are thinking, is, are there ways of teaching young people how to use social networking sites or how to engage with the internet in such a way that we can kind of align goals and perspectives and make it more plausible to maximize opportunities and minimize risks. So there are lots of ways in which we might think about questions of skills, and I'm conscious that Alan Helsper is here, who has a particular kind of conception of how we might think about those. I'm going to take a slightly different approach here, though I hope complementary, in looking back at the history of media literacy research and asking what can we take from that longer history of research to think about the present problem, as it were, of social media literacy. It's slightly naughty to put the world of television in black and white, because actually this still describes, in a slightly updated version, many families' engagement with the media, and also many families' challenge. But what I want to point to is that we have half a century of research on the ways in which not only children learn to engage with television, but also on the ways in which they might be taught better to engage with television. And what that research is often interested in, and has been interested in, is how children learn to make distinctions about what is real or fiction on the screen, what is fact or fake, what is true or persuasive. So how do they learn what is an advertisement and what is a program? How do they learn what is the news, which is supposedly true, and what is a drama? How do they learn what is kind of age appropriate, in other words, for them, for their age group, or for others older than them? And as an enterprise to teach children televisual literacy, as it were, there's been a hugely complex body of work that has tried to teach children in the sense about semiotics, in the sense about kind of political economy of the institutions that are addressing them, and why it is that they might be drawn into, or how those institutions might be trying to appeal to them, how it is that programs are constructed, even to engage in some media production so that they can, as it were, look behind the screen and decode it more critically and more wisely. So I think it's interesting to kind of speculate about how much of that legacy of research can we now say will help us understand today's challenge of how children engage with all the different kinds of screens that they are using. And we can see some kind of obvious analogies, because children using social media today also need to kind of work out how to decode the affordances of the internet, how to use the various kinds of affordances, the various kinds of facilities of what marking things as private or public, making contacts, expressing affiliation through likes, identifying again what is advertising and what is public information, publicly produced information. But we could also say that through these screens, children are learning to decode their social world, their wider world, as it is encoded into text. In other words, there's kind of two layers of textual problem. One is how to engage with the device, its affordances, the way in which it enables certain kinds of interactional possibilities, and also how to engage with their peers or with strangers or whoever they are engaging with in their social world, because all of those relationships are now encoded into text in a way that they were not in the days of, as it were, predominantly face-to-face communication, and a whole new set of questions about what we could say social media literacy then arise. So who are the audiences for their kinds of communications? How do they manage the ways in which their interactions in their social world become persistent, become difficult to delete or eradicate, become kind of scalable in ways that are in fact new. So there are analogies with the televisual challenge, and then there is a kind of extension of that challenge in terms of all of our social lives becoming encoded into text. So the way in which research on televisual literacy worked was it tended to tell a developmental story, and it told that developmental story largely framed through the work of Jean Piaget. And there was a kind of useful coincidence, I think, for them that the history of television mapped onto a particular dominance of developmental psychology. So there was a nice alignment between an account of children's social and cognitive development and their engagement with the media. And as we might want to address in the discussion, we don't have such a kind of neat consensual developmental psychology account to draw upon now. So I'm going to kind of play with the Piagetian account, but I'm also going to suggest some difficulties with it. So the kind of classic account in television literacy was that up to the age of about 7, but certainly at this kind of age, children couldn't tell what was real and what was fake. They made all kinds of misunderstandings of the conventions of the genre, all kinds of misconceptions of whether, I don't know, a shooting was real, whether what the intentions of the characters were. There was a kind of struggle after meaning that wasn't generally successful, except for programming very particularly created for that age group. And of course there was then a lot of effort to create programs especially for that age group, which I don't think we're yet seeing in the same way on the internet. I think there's another kind of possible discussion point, but I think there is some questions about what exactly we expect young children to be doing on the internet, and they're spending a lot of time with material made for older people. In the classic Piagetian account, round about 7 or 8, I made a bit of a guess about how old these kids are, children are beginning to kind of grasp how do you make those distinctions between what's real and what's not real, what's well-intentioned and what's ill-intentioned, beginning to kind of piece together the narrative so that they can kind of see how a puzzle comes to a resolution, beginning to kind of make a link between the happy ending or the unhappy ending for the villain and the moral message of a drama. But this is kind of fragile around about 7 or 8 and is gradually developing over those following years until round about 12, which might be a little bit before these girls, when the story more or less comes to an end in saying that children by around 12 have pretty much kind of reached a more or less adult understanding of how to decode television as text and make the judgments about narrative, about morality, about reality, about representation that are much like those that adults would. In addition to that kind of story of social cognitive development, we could also look at a more social developmental account and ask ourselves, well, what else is going on in the life of the child as they go through these ages and stages? What are the ways in which at this age they are kind of preschool, pre-institution, pretty much focused on the home, pretty much trusting of their parents, pretty focused on play unless things are going wrong in their lives, but for the most part, at a certain point, the kind of demands of school and the peer group take over. We could tell a different kind of story then about the sources of authority in children's lives and the ways in which they are beginning to kind of shift their priorities to be embedded in a different notion of play and a more peer-based set of interests. And then again, in later stages, what is adolescence all about? It's about the kind of shift away from adult authority, finding one's own identity, expressing autonomy, kind of beginning to make one's own judgments, developing intimate and private relationships of one's own. So we have a cognitive story, but we could also have a social story, and both of them could give some kind of guidance in understanding what is going on as children from a young age, as they get older, are now engaging with the challenge that their social relations are encoded in text in these complex and rather, I think sometimes opaque technological sites and interfaces. So as I already hinted, there's been a lot of critique of our ages and stages approach, and that critique, I have to say, I have some ambivalence about, because if it's stated as something invariant and essentializing a 7-year-old as a 7-year-old and therefore will act in this way, by 12 some light bulb will go on and a new moment of illumination will arrive, then of course it's too crude and simplistic a story. But no story has emerged, I suggest, to really replace it. And so my preference would be to say, let's take this as a kind of a fairly meaningful account of progression, which of course different children will variously go through depending on their life circumstances, how it is that they develop, what are the opportunities and what are the hindrances that they encounter in their lives. So unfortunately for this theory, ideally we would have begun the qualitative work in EU Kids Online with children around about the age of 3 or 4, but we didn't. We began with children from 9 years old. So I'm going to kind of have to begin my story of social media literacy here and leave it to others, perhaps in this room, to contemplate how to think about the earlier part of the social media literacy story. So very briefly on method, taking our 11 to 16-year-olds, we conducted qualitative work across 9 European countries. So now I can say Giovanna was the Italian researcher and Leslie and I were the British, and I don't think there's more of us here, maybe there are online. And we were uncertain whether children would speak more freely in circumstances of group discussions at school or one-on-one interviews, and so we did a mix. And I think in the end we concluded that different children might feel differently comfortable in different circumstances, but I'm not going to make so very much of that. And then I wanted to try to kind of find a way of not analysing all of the data in a qualitative way, because it was a vast amount of data. So I decided to pick 4 countries which were kind of scattered across Europe and rather different. So this map is Ellen Helsper's map, or one that she kind of led on the creation of, which was to try to identify ways in which parenting, risk and opportunity structures across Europe could be said to differ by country. And so the 2 countries that I've picked then, Britain and Spain, we called protected by restrictions, countries where parents took a fairly restrictive approach. Children were not engaging in so many opportunities, but parents were quite safety conscious. And the Czech Republic and Romania, which we called semi-supported risky gamers. So the children had some support, they did a lot of gaming, a lot of online engagement. We saw them taking a number of risks. So I put this up because it was important to the design, and EU Kids Online has a larger report which looks through all of these different findings well beyond questions of social networking, and reports on the overall findings and also on country trends. But I'm not going to say so much about countries. I want to focus on age, and particularly focus on age in relation to social networking, the way in which the children talked about social networking sites or social networking. And I'm going to organise the presentation then of the findings according to what the children said, round about 9 to 11, round about 11 to 13, and round about 14 to 16. And I'm going to try and tell you a story of how I see their social media literacy developing across those kind of 3 phases, bearing in mind that there is some mess and variation within that trend. But I think there is a story of social media literacy developing. And I think, as I'll try and draw out, it is, as it were, both shaped by questions of cognitive development and social development. And at the same time, it is itself an interaction with the affordances of the sites that they're talking about, often which is Facebook, but not always. So one of the things that's interesting is the way in which they begin to talk about their social life and their relations through the affordances of the sites that they are using. So this is 9 to 11-year-olds. So for the 9 to 11-year-olds, I want to suggest that one of the key questions, just like for young children watching television, is the question of what is real and what is fake. Only now that question applies in the world of social networking online. And it occurs in a context where the children are, in any way, rather ambivalent about the importance and value of social networking. So they're not, as we saw from the survey findings, they're not, many of them, using social networking sites, though some are and they're beginning to. And they are expressed a number of kind of puzzles in the discussions. You know, why would you not just call or meet your friends? Why would you go on these sites? Are there better ways of talking to your friends? So some of their talk about social networking and what it means comes out of a kind of ignorance of their own, or lack of depth of experience. And thus there was a lot of talk about strangers, and strangers are kind of linked in their mind to hackers, and a sort of set of concerns, or even the kind of passing around of cautionary tales about how people might steal your photo and paste it onto a naked body, and then it would look like it was you, and you would be, there would be a problem. Or strangers could easily hack into your account and see your personal stuff. So they talked about a range of kinds of risks. They saw social networking sites often as quite risky. And the risks were about strangers breaking in and finding them, paedophiles getting in touch, all the swearing and nudity on Facebook, one group of Romanian girls complained about. I want to suggest that somehow in their talk there was a kind of sense of a rather clear boundary between the online, where all this kind of dodgy, difficult stuff happened, and the offline, where they lived in their lives and were actually reasonably happy until it entered onto their horizon that perhaps they should start social networking, and they began to worry a bit about it. So they're kind of working with a relatively clear online-offline boundary, and a kind of mapping of that onto what's known and unknown, or what's risky and what's safe. So a sense that the risk of harm kind of originates online and can extend out to attack their person or their property. And a preoccupation in a lot of the discussion with how do you tell where that boundary is, and how do you kind of manage that boundary? How do you decide when those online people are real or fake or forging things? One Romanian girl said there are people who spend their entire day online searching for passwords. And there was a certain amount of talk, kind of working out the tests. You know, how do you decide what's real and what's fake in this online world? How do you kind of unmask the fakeness? So the kids would pass tips amongst each other, like you can tell if a social networking site has been hacked by seeing if any of your friends posted the nasty message, and if not, you know it came from a stranger. Or you can trust what's said online if you and the person who said it have got a friend in common, but if you haven't got a friend in common, you probably can't trust it. So they're kind of trying to identify the tests for unmasking the fake, or to decide what they can trust. And as they know, this is no easy task. So this boy here, he kind of expresses the ambivalence. It actually reminds me of the literature in children and television, where one of my favourite observations from Amy Dorr was the child who said, and this was a younger child, probably about 7, I know that the guns they use on television are fake because I've been told, but perhaps a real one kind of slips in, and you know, you're never quite sure that they're all, you know. This is kind of anxiety that you think you know what the test is, but you might be going to get it wrong. And so here's one child not certain. Here's another. He kind of knew that this was a stranger. He knew that he should say no. He did say no, but the person came back and he kind of got drawn in, and then he did give the email to the stranger, and in fact his dad had to come in and rescue the situation. So a kind of online-offline distinction as a kind of distorted window on the world, and an effort among the children to kind of build some kind of barriers to decide what it is that they would let through. And a willingness to go to their parents when there was any problem, which is not characteristic of the older children. Even at that age, we had some kids who were already kind of into the drama that we think of more as adolescent. So we had one Spanish 10-year-old girl talking about spreading insults as a kind of weird kind of a joke, and one British girl who I think Leslie interviewed at about 10, who was just fascinated with the drama of being rude and falling out and making up and seeing what would happen next. And at that point we begin to see the tip over from the threat coming not from strangers but from people within your peer group, and the real difficulty which characterises the next age group of having to manage your own peers. So this is quotes from 11 to 13-year-olds, among whom social networking is really common now. So it's become a transition from the littler children. They still do turn to their parents for some kind of security, though this is not often enough recognised. But they are also keen to keep their online interactions private, and they're keen to keep them private because the focus is now shifted kind of meaningfully to the interactions within the peer group. So the tips that these kids are passing around are not only about the online, but also about how to keep your parents out of your online lives, and how to kind of have double passwords or extra profiles, or, you know, is it okay if your mum is on your Facebook and so forth. They're kind of policing the boundary against their parents, as well as trying to manage their online worlds. Because they're seeing the risks and the kind of risky opportunities together as emanating from within the peer group, so this is really now in the terrain of conduct problems, but also conduct opportunities. There is not anymore that kind of neat line between what is a problem and what is a great online interaction. And there's much more kind of experimentation with the world of risky opportunities. So we kind of see a lot of the drama. So here's a kind of classic case of what Dana Boyd has called drama. It's not exactly seen as a problem, it's not exactly seen as a great thing, it's what happens, and it's fascinating, and it absorbs, and they kind of all get drawn into it. And I think the way in which this girl describes, you know, you might think she's describing a problem, she's going to walk away or she's going to deal with it, but no, she's not going to let, you know, the girl get away with it. She's going to get stuck in and starts kind of within the drama. So it's not a risk, it's not an opportunity, it's drama on in between. Which is this one. So here's another kind of complicated story about how recognizing the different ways in which young people might position themselves and how they might kind of get engaged. It depends on their mood, it depends how they act. They might just delete and walk away, but they might act vulgar back. And the fight can go on a really long time. And yet there's a pleasure in it. They're getting all these questions. She must be talking about, she's talking about Ask. Ask FM as it was, it's now being cleaned up, even in the last year. And so you begin to see the kind of social validation of getting lots of questions, getting lots of likes, kind of getting drawn in, and then they begin to talk about what it is that the young people, what it is that the children will do to get the likes, including one focus group in Romania where the girls are talking about taking their clothes off in order to maximise their likes, and you see where drama tips over into risk. So lots of accounts of drama which I think are just very kind of complicated for that adult view looking in to understand what is going on. And the young people themselves are just trying to kind of work it out. So one group said, you know, we're rude to each other so much on Facebook, but when it comes to face-to-face, we have nothing to say to each other. There's something about the site that generates the drama. Or, yes, this one. So if something happens in real life, it has to then go online. It has to be visible on Facebook. It has to be kind of made real on Facebook. And then that draws more people in. And if they didn't know, then they'll ask offline. And the online and the offline, as you can see, have kind of blurred. So now the question is, as I've kind of put at the top, not what's real and what's fake, but when is it fun and when has it gone too far? How do we kind of navigate that boundary of trust, of anticipating the consequences of interactions, of deciding who is to blame, of kind of knowing when something might become a problem and when it is acceptable. And so there was a fair amount of talk even about what is a friend, and how do you decide when you can trust people and when are things getting out of control, and what are the kind of social pressures on them to be part of that of that interaction and that Facebook. And the social networking sites kind of complicate matters. So a Romanian 13-year-old girl said, if you click on the Facebook button to say that you're in a relationship, then there are all these intrusive questions about who you're in a relationship with. But if you say you're not in a relationship, then you seem available. And so then there are all these kind of other intrusive things about, well, you know, what are you up for? And there isn't an in-between state. The social network site has somehow intruded and created a kind of drama that is complicating their lives. So they're talking about what do they do when their friendships break up? When is it better to make kind of multiple profiles so that they can move between a group they used to be friends with, a group they want to move to? As they do that, their digital footprints become unmanageable. They start forgetting their passwords, so they're kind of confused about who's meant to know what about them. It's getting, so they were very keen to talk about testing digital footprints, who does know what about you, and so forth. So it's all quite a way already from that question of what's real, what's fake, who's a stranger, what's fine. And there's a lot of talk about strategies and to kind of manage the peer relations, and a lot of exchange of stories of when things go wrong. And so they have, where is my other? Yeah, maybe I said those ones, yes. So one group of Czech 13 to 14-year-olds describes setting up a kind of fake man's profile, and then one of their friends begins to fall in love with this person. And they said it was funny at the beginning, but gradually it became embarrassing, and then the fraud was discovered, and the friend was really angry, and the girls were at the point of the interview in a kind of reflective mood. Their narratives are becoming quite kind of, you to tell these stories about how something began one way and it turned into something else. And they're trying to work out the moment when they could kind of intervene and manage that process of things turning and controlling. Or a group of Spanish girls were thoughtful about a case of sexting that became a problem in their school. And they say, because you trust that boy, and if you trust someone and then he fails you, and it's your fault because you've trusted someone who didn't deserve it, but there's nothing you can do. So you have to be 100% sure of what you're doing and decide what you can do, and you can't be 100% sure. So they're kind of caught in this world of uncertainty and complexity. At the same time, there are also kids within this age group who are not looking for everything to be safe, uncertain, and predictable. They are enjoying fanning the flames, deliberately being vulgar, insulting, teasing each other, threatening to steal each other's boyfriends, and so forth. One group of British 11 to 12-year-olds discussed how funny it was when someone asked to have a nasty image of them taken down, because that was a visible admission that the person had been upset, and so they kind of knew that they'd won, and they were all having a good giggle about that. Another girl complained about being excluded from a massive argument on BBM because she didn't have a BlackBerry. She wanted to be in the argument. It's not that they are all, as it were, good souls. Okay, lots more stories there, but I'm conscious of time. So 11 to 13. So then getting a little bit older, this is now 14 to 16, and the question has shifted again. Oh, I'm trying to capture 2 or 3 years of young people's lives in a burning question, but the question is shifting, not from what's fun and what does it say about when does it go too far, but what do my activities say about my values, about the kind of person that I am. And we see young people beginning to kind of ask questions about who am I, that I act in the way that I do. What does it say about me? So here's a girl, she's a Spanish 14-year-old girl talking about getting a friend request. And she doesn't, as she would have done just a few years ago, probably just say, yes, I add you to my friends because now I can count how many I have. She says, well, I need to know something about who this is and what do I need that contact for, because who knows what she is and what she's looking for. There's a kind of weighing of motivations and weighing of values and a willingness to say, I don't need to have all of these contacts if they don't serve me and my purposes. So we could see a kind of wising up in a way, but on the other hand, by 14 to 16, their lives have become more complicated. So cognitively, they've learned more, but socially, they're in a different world. They're in a world where they might be having sexual relationships. They're in a world where they might be drinking. They will be, might be much less in contact with their parents as people that they can go to and kind of share intimacies with and feel that someone is looking out for them. So their lives are more complicated even as it is that they have kind of learned more. And so they're talking about more serious risks, even though they understand the interface much better. So they're talking about sexual harassment, about hate groups, about explicit pornography and its sharing within the peer group, about being, about trolling, and about a kind of intense emotional spillover between their online and offline lives. And though that spillover is often very gendered. So there's quite a lot of talk among the girls about the sexual double sexual standard, where they're encouraged to behave in particular ways, either on or offline. And then they are slammed very often online if they engage in various kinds of sexual activities. And the boys' stories similarly are becoming tougher. More talk about arguing and swearing and racist insults and getting blocked on Facebook and kind of causing trouble in the peer group. So the greater maturity we could see is bringing them both resilience and a new kind of vulnerability, and it seems to kind of intensify their interest in social networking to the point where they talk about their social relations through the language of social networking. So they talk about blocking people or deleting people, somehow ambiguously from their offline worlds as well as their online world, rather than, as it were, making friends and breaking friends. They add people and so forth. A fair amount of talk about sharing passwords, and the point about sharing passwords, of course, that is an act of trust, and you trust the people who are your kind of person, who share your values and affirm who you are, and then the sharing of passwords adds a new layer of problems, particularly as relationships move on and digital footprints get more and more complicated. At the same time, by this age group, you can see that the kids have kind of worked out that you can create all kinds of problems online, but they don't stay online, they spill over offline, they've got to be addressed offline, and so they are, as it were, kind of thinking twice. And so you see also some of this talk about moving away from Facebook or moving away from the different social network sites. Though we could talk about that, they haven't really moved away. They've just shifted their commitments and gone to find other sites where affordances are different yet again. Okay, so my last slide to conclude is to say, okay, so what does all this tell us about media, social media literacy? So my purpose was to try to take a kind of bottom-up approach, to listen to the way in which children talk about the different ways in which they were engaging with social networking, from the point where it was a rather new thing in their lives through to the moment when they were beginning to kind of move away, but through a kind of intense and experimental engagement in the middle. We could see the ways in which I think children are maturing both socially and cognitively, and I have described something that could fit ages and stages approach, but I'm not saying that any stages are necessarily better or worse than any others, nor that every child has to go through exactly the same invariant sequence. I think it's helpful to observe the trend, and I think it's helpful for us to begin to theorize what is it we do think is going to be different between the 9-year-old, the 12-year-old, and the 15-year-old, because there's a bit of a gap in psychological theory. So my account then of social media literacy, which does see them asking, because of those are the questions of becoming social and learning how to navigate one's social world. But one can also see the ways in which the particular affordances of different kinds of sites kind of get cued into that, making some things visible, making some things private, making some things more complicated than they might otherwise have been. And so I think it kind of raises the question, and I'll end with that question really, of how much, instead of trying to teach children and young people just to kind of manage their social relations online as offline, be responsible, don't go on until you're 13, keep your passwords private, we might instead kind of shift the focus to thinking, what can we teach them about the nature of this online space? What can we teach them about the kind of political economy of why the sites are as they are, why Facebook has a real names policy, for example, who that data is becoming managed and shared or mismanaged on different sites, how it is that we might teach them to identify the affordances of sites and make judgments about how much that suits their interests. So we might kind of take that semiotic come critical edifice that we developed for traditional mass media and see how much that can also be taught in relation to the world of social media.
Thank you, Sonia, for that. There is an enormous amount to unpack from that. So this will be on our YouTube channel to watch again, to unpack. I was just sitting there. There was an intense discussion going on Twitter while this was on, and some of the some of those issues around, you know, the digital identity and the lasting resonance of digital identity, and the issue of teaching digital identity, and how that either gets portrayed as stranger danger, or, you know, is it a positive approach to how that identity can develop through the usage of the technology, has engaged Twitter very, very much. So this is a good opportunity for those who are on Twitter. If you want to post your questions, you can to LSENetEdge, hashtag LSENetEdge, and we've had some people watching to get those questions. But the first question, as always, traditionally, we shall offer to the room. I will give you the microphone so people online can hear.
Thanks very much, Sonia. My question is, who do you think's role it is to teach children about social media literacy? Do you think it's something, you know, that parents and teachers should do together? And, you know, where's the sort of line? I worry a bit that some of the parents are probably the worst people to teach their children this, but I'm really unclear as to who, you know, should be teaching it, whether the school has a role.
I think the school has a role. I think the school has a key role, because it's the school's duty to manage children's peer relations, though it does actually either support or really disrupt school life if they don't. But because school is the only place that can reach the majority of children and teach something in the kind of pedagogic sense, up knowledge over time and addressing difficulties as and when they arise, and building on kind of layering up knowledge as it becomes more complex. So an educational role is only open to teachers. So parents, of course, have a different role, but they're much more troubleshooting when something goes wrong, and they also hope that they can deliver a lesson in 5 minutes. You know, don't forget, if you're going on Facebook, you mustn't share your passwords and you mustn't upload photos and don't do anything nasty. But they kind of, you know, that's useful and that's informative, and it might be completely ignored, but it's not really, you know, if we think of literacy as a hard-won set of competences over years, it doesn't come that way. Parents do teach, of course, and primarily they teach by example. And I would love parents to become a bit more aware that if they're going to, you know, do stupid things on social networking sites and upload every picture of their child the minute they're born and so on, then they are setting a kind of precedent and setting an example. So there are different modes of learning, but just to add one more, I think these guys are giving us all an enormous problem because they are changing the affordances all the time. They are designing a very complex and opaque and difficult to comprehend interface through which relationships are occurring. And, you know, I've been studying this for years. I'm still hard pressed to tell you what Facebook's latest change to its privacy or its data usage rules were, and I think everyone is. So it's now like this fantastically, you know, media literacy is about teaching what that interface does between you and the world, and this is just really hard.
Question from Twitter, and in this case, Dr. Bex Lewis is asking, are there up-to-date stats regarding stranger danger? She gets asked that a lot, and she's guessing whether maybe a maximum, say, 1 in 5 would be a stranger, or are there any statistics regarding this?
So I would like to tweet back, what is a stranger? Because that's also complex. So if we mean malign, ill-intentioned paedophile who is looking for a child to abuse, fantastically rare and no decent stats anyway. But if we are looking for the answer to the question, how many children have been in touch with somebody that they don't know from their social circle, then Giovanna has the latest statistics and she'll tell you it is 8%. I often make up stats and I'm not sure. Yes, 12%.
Cross-cultural variation. For example, Italian children are the one who are more likely to add friends of friends onto their social network circles. Yeah. While this behavior is much lower in the UK and other countries. In the UK, most children accept requests of.
Could see in a developmental pattern or in with different types of young people. Obviously, the context is different, and some of the affordances of the world in which we act are different. But I just wondered if you had any
background. Well, I think it's a good question, and sometimes I think that the entire field of media literacy could be resolved in two different directions which have nothing to do with the media. One is social literacy, how do we read our world, and the other is critical literacy, which is kind of how do we make wise judgments within our world. So why do we persist in talking about media literacy, or not only that, but also social media literacy, or advertising literacy, or film literacy, or goodness knows what? Because the task of engaging with the world is mediated in particular ways. And so I don't think it's a matter of saying social literacy here and media literacy here, but it's a matter of where you want to put the emphasis. And I think one of the things that a lot of children, young people, and those concerned with them are struggling with is how far the digital media interfaces are kind of reconfiguring what it is they can understand, how they can make those judgments, how they can understand, you know. So friend now means something a bit different in the Facebook age than it meant 10 years ago, though we could debate it. But in a way, social literacies are being a bit reconfigured by social media, and the literacy challenges, it's a point of emphasis. But I was very struck by the way in which the children often talk about their social relations through who do they know on Facebook, or how many likes did they get, or who have they blocked or deleted. So it also, the media become a language for talking about the world, as it were.
It's not just me in secret making up all these questions with random names, by the way.
You do.
A question from Casbeth, which already has generated quite a bit of debate during the talk on Twitter. How much are children aware of the long-term effects of their social media profile, in particular with regard to future professions?
Well, I think it's not really a question that we asked very directly in the research, and I am astonished by I've seen very little. I can't really think of research which actually addresses that question. And I find it mind-blowing because adults are always talking about it. And they talk, about how the digital footprint will adversely affect your future, and they talk about how universities make decisions on I've never known a university admissions officer who's got time to check people's Facebook. You know, reading the forms is bad enough. Though there are kind of myths about or there's stories about employers sometimes checking and asking for Facebook passwords and so on. So I think the talk is beginning to filter out there. How much it has a real kind of basis in A, what children understand, and B, what they need to understand, I don't know. I'm more struck by information overload. By the time these kids are 25 or 50 and still going for jobs, or maybe we'll just know everything about them.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for our Twitter audience for engaging in the debate and questions. Just a small piece of the usual use of this time to promote our next couple of NetworkED and Edges. Our next NetworkED is next week, which will be in this room, and we're bringing together a panel of students and chaired by an alumni of the LSE to talk about the role of education in developing the entrepreneurs and innovators of the future. Our next NetworkEDGE is in May, on Wednesday the 20th of May, and we're doing another panel discussion. We've been a bit taken by the panel discussion idea on the role of education in encouraging women to work in technology. And we've got a number of esteemed people on that panel, and we actually have the chair of that panel, Ellen Helsper, in the room today. So we're sort of lots of cross-referencing to people in the room today. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. You can continue to follow the debate on LSE NetEdge. And for those of you who are here, unfortunately, we don't have the same offer for people on Twitter and on YouTube, but we do have wine upstairs in R301. In R301, a couple of doors up, and we can take you up. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sonia, for an enlightening and sort of impactful talk. Thank you.